In the late 1980s, Mexico's drug underworld began to shift. The once dominant Guadalajara cartel, led by Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, was falling apart after his arrest for the murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena. That single event sent shockwaves through the Mexican drug scene. With the top boss locked up, his lieutenants began dividing his empire, carving up trafficking routes and regions. Out of this chaos, the seeds of the Sinaloa Cartel were planted. In the rugged mountains of northwestern Mexico, in a state known more for its agriculture than its criminality, a new kind of criminal organization started forming, one that would eventually become the most powerful cartel the country had ever seen. Sinaloa, a place filled with steep hills, isolated towns, and thick jungle, offered perfect cover for anyone looking to move illegal goods without detection. The people who grew up there knew the land intimately. Many had lived off it for generations, cultivating marijuana and opium poppy, often with little other means of income. The region's remote terrain also made it hard for law enforcement to penetrate, and even harder for them to control. That isolation gave ambitious traffickers room to grow and plan. Among the emerging faces of this era were Joaquín Guzmán Loera, better known as El Chapo, along with Hector Luis Palma Salazar and Ismael El Mayo Zambada. All three had ties to the Guadalajara cartel, and all three were ruthless, resourceful, and determined to rise. El Chapo started out as a low-level operative, running shipments and guarding loads. He had a reputation early on for being both aggressive and clever, someone who knew how to make things happen. By the time Felix Gallardo was arrested, El Chapo had already started operating his own routes and making connections. As the Guadalajara cartel crumbled, Chapo saw the opportunity. He aligned with Palma and Zambada, forming an early core of what would become the Sinaloa Cartel. Together, they began seizing territory and building a distribution network that could move cocaine from Colombia up through Central America, across Mexico, and into the United States. But they weren't satisfied with just crossing the border the usual way. El Chapo introduced an innovation that changed the game: underground drug tunnels. Chapo's team engineered elaborate tunnels that ran beneath the US-Mexico border, outfitted with ventilation systems, rails, and lights. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were feats of engineering designed to carry tons of drugs into California and Arizona without detection. The tunnels became one of the cartel's trademarks, helping them avoid checkpoints and radar systems that had started to clamp down on traditional trafficking routes. These tunnels gave them a serious edge over rivals and let them expand quickly into US markets. At the same time, the Sinaloa Cartel was securing its hold on Mexican soil. The leadership knew that brute force alone wouldn't be enough. They invested heavily in bribing officials, mayors, police chiefs, military commanders. They made deals with local power brokers and used both money and violence to bend the system. In places where cooperation couldn't be bought, they brought out the guns. El Chapo and his partners were cold-blooded when they needed to be. They would ambush convoys, assassinate rivals, and disappear entire families to make a point. The message was clear: you're either with us or you're gone. But what really helped the cartel grow in these early years wasn't just muscle. It was their business sense. Chapo and Mayo understood supply chains the way Wall Street CEOs understood global finance. They weren't just moving drugs, they were building a logistics empire. They didn't limit themselves to one product either. While Colombian cocaine was still king, marijuana and heroin were big earners too, especially as demand rose in the US. Sinaloa, farmers grew the crops, local operators processed them, and smugglers moved them through a constantly shifting set of routes. The cartel even began experimenting with methamphetamines, which would later become one of their most profitable products. One of the key strategies that allowed them to operate with such efficiency was decentralization. Rather than build a rigid hierarchy, Sinaloa functioned more like a franchise. Local bosses ran their regions semi-independently, sending a cut of their earnings back up the chain. This made the cartel more flexible and harder to take down. If one piece got arrested or killed, the rest kept going. It also made the organization appealing to ambitious young criminals looking for a way into the trade. You didn't need to be born into the inner circle. If you could produce results, you earned your place. By the mid-1990s, the Sinaloa Cartel had established itself as a major force in the Mexican drug world. Their network stretched from the jungles of Colombia to the streets of Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Chicago. They had bought off border patrol agents and police departments, and they had carved out trafficking corridors that were so profitable they sparked wars with rival groups. But at this stage, the cartel was still operating in a relatively low-profile way. While Chapo was known to authorities, he hadn't yet reached the level of infamy that would come later. He was moving quietly, letting the business grow, and watching the money pile up. Even so, the violence that came with their rise couldn't be ignored. Towns across Sinaloa and Sonora began to see rising levels of disappearances and executions. Bodies were found dumped on roadsides or hanging from bridges, often marked with threatening messages. Journalists who dared report on the cartel's actions frequently went missing or were killed. Still, the organization managed to maintain a degree of community support, especially in rural areas where the government had long failed to provide basic services. In some towns, the cartel built schools, handed out food, or paid for medical care. These acts weren't out of kindness, they were strategic. If the people saw you as a provider, they were less likely to turn you in. As the 1990s came to a close, the Mexican government started feeling more pressure from the United States to take action against the cartels. The North American Free Trade Agreement had opened new trade routes, but it also made drug smuggling easier. US agencies were watching closely, and Mexico knew it couldn't turn a blind eye forever. Still, the Sinaloa Cartel had entrenched itself so deeply in the system that taking it apart would prove far more complicated than anyone imagined. And at the heart of it all, pulling strings and making moves from the shadows, was a man who would soon become one of the most wanted fugitives on Earth, El Chapo Guzmán. By the turn of the millennium, the Sinaloa Cartel was no longer just one of many criminal groups. It had become a dominant force, thanks in large part to the cunning leadership of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. But that rise wasn't without its setbacks. In 1993, El Chapo was arrested in Guatemala and extradited to Mexico. He was sentenced to 20 years and imprisoned at Puente Grande, a high-security facility. For many other leaders, that would have been the end of the story. But for Chapo, it was just a pause. Even behind bars, he remained active. He kept in contact with his associates, continued to oversee operations, and made sure that the cartel's power didn't weaken in his absence. Then came one of the most talked about prison escapes in Mexican history. In 2001, El Chapo vanished from Puente Grande, reportedly hidden in a laundry cart. The escape was humiliating for the Mexican government and revealed how deep the cartel's influence had reached into the prison system. Bribes had been paid, guards had looked the other way, and Chapo had walked out the front door. Once free, he wasted no time in taking back full control. The Sinaloa Cartel kicked into overdrive. The early 2000s were defined by expansion and consolidation. Chapo wasn't just interested in surviving. He wanted dominance. He and his closest allies, including Ismael El Mayo Zambada, began targeting rival cartels and eating away at their territories. The Tijuana Cartel, once feared under the Arellano Felix brothers, started to lose its grip. The Juarez Cartel, another former heavyweight, began to fracture. And in the midst of this power vacuum, the Sinaloa Cartel surged forward, backed by an army of hitmen, corrupt officials, and smugglers willing to do whatever it took. One of the most crucial moves during this period was forming temporary alliances. Chapo knew how to use people, and he knew how to discard them. He worked closely with the Beltran Leyva brothers, a group of traffickers with their own networks and influence. Together, they launched brutal offensives against mutual enemies. With their combined resources, they were able to push deep into enemy territory, flooding cities with drugs while eliminating competition through targeted assassinations and massacres. But power struggles always simmered beneath the surface, and the partnership wouldn't last forever. Back in the US, Sinaloa's reach had become impossible to ignore. Federal agents started noticing a pattern. Wherever drugs were being seized, Sinaloa fingerprints were on the packaging. Cities like Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles, and Phoenix saw increasing flows of heroin, meth, cocaine, and marijuana, all linked back to Mexico. What made the cartel especially hard to fight was its decentralized structure. Local cells operated independently, but stayed loyal to the main leadership. If one crew got busted, others kept the operation moving without disruption. Meanwhile, the cartel was evolving into something far more than a drug smuggling business. It became a full-scale criminal empire. Chapo and his partners diversified into real estate, construction, agriculture, and even legitimate businesses that helped launder money. Billions of dollars were moving through shell companies, offshore accounts, and front operations. It became nearly impossible to tell where the criminal world ended and the legal world began. That financial flexibility gave the Sinaloa Cartel an edge over less sophisticated groups, allowing them to weather storms, bribe higher-ranking officials, and invest in newer, smarter ways of moving product. Violence remained a central tool of control. The cartel developed a specialized enforcement wing known as Los Antrax, a group of young, heavily armed men who carried out hits, kidnappings, and public executions. Los Antrax became infamous for their flashy lifestyles, designer clothes, gold-plated guns, and brazen social media posts. They acted both as killers and as psychological warfare. Their purpose wasn't just to eliminate threats. It was to send a message. If you crossed the cartel, there would be nowhere to hide. Despite the bloodshed, the cartel enjoyed a strange kind of popularity in certain parts of Mexico. People in Sinaloa and other rural states often saw Chapo not just as a criminal, but as a folk hero. He built soccer fields, threw parties, and paid for surgeries in communities where the government had long been absent. Narco corridos, ballads glorifying drug traffickers, became wildly popular, with songs written about Chapo's daring escapes, his wealth, and his ability to outsmart authorities. This image helped build loyalty and silence among locals, making it even harder for law enforcement to gather intelligence. As the decade progressed, cracks began to form in the cartel's alliances. The Beltran-Leyva brothers began to feel sidelined. They believed Chapo had betrayed them by tipping off the government about Alfredo Beltran-Leyva's location, leading to his arrest in 2008. That accusation split the two groups apart. The Beltran-Leyva organization declared war on the Sinaloa Cartel, and what followed was one of the bloodiest internal conflicts in the history of Mexico's drug war. Suddenly, the cartel wasn't just fighting rivals like the Zetas or the Tijuana group. It was at war with its own former allies. Cities became war zones. Gun battles erupted in broad daylight. High-ranking officials, judges, and even civilians got caught in the crossfire. Entire families disappeared overnight. Each side tried to outdo the other in brutality, often leaving mutilated bodies in public spaces as warnings. And yet, through all of this, Chapo stayed one step ahead. He was always moving, rarely spending more than a night in one place. Protected by private armies and local politicians, he became a ghost, impossible to pin down. Back in the United States, authorities were building their case. The DEA and FBI were tracking shipments, flipping informants, and listening in on wiretaps. They knew Chapo was the top target, and they were working with Mexican intelligence to coordinate a capture. The media had already turned him into a legend. Articles described his wealth, his daring, his ruthless precision. Every escape and every shootout only added to the myth. He was no longer just a drug lord. He was a symbol of how broken the system had become. The Mexican government, under pressure from both inside and outside, began ramping up its military offensive against the cartels. Soldiers were sent into the streets. Helicopters circled rural villages. Entire neighborhoods were locked down in search of high-value targets. But every time they came close to catching Chapo, he slipped through. Rumors spread about elaborate underground bunkers, safe houses with secret exits, and even plastic surgeries to alter his appearance. Whether true or not, those stories only reinforced the belief that El Chapo was untouchable. By the end of the 2000s, the Sinaloa Cartel had emerged as the most powerful criminal organization in Mexico. It controlled more territory, moved more product, and made more money than any other group in the country. Its network stretched from the poppy fields of the Sierra Madre to the suburbs of Chicago. Its leaders were billionaires, its enemies were dead or in hiding, and at the top of it all stood El Chapo Guzmán, the man who had escaped prison, built an empire, and dared the world to stop him. As the 2010s began, the Sinaloa Cartel stood like a fortress, wealthy, entrenched, and still led by a man who had become nearly mythical. But holding the throne was never easy, especially in a country where loyalty was always for sale, and power could shift in a single night. The cartel was stronger than ever, but it was also surrounded by enemies and riddled with internal tensions. The brutal fallout with the Beltran Leyva organization had sparked a new wave of violence, and another rival was emerging fast: the Zetas. Formed by ex-military commandos, the Zetas weren't just violent, they were strategic, militarized, and highly disciplined. They began to push into territories long controlled by the Sinaloa Cartel, igniting battles that left cities torn apart. The war between Sinaloa and its rivals wasn't limited to shootouts in the hills. It exploded into public life. Streets became battle zones. Grenades were thrown into nightclubs. Gunmen stormed police stations. Cartel messages were painted on walls or hung from bridges, often beside the bodies of enemies or traitors. Entire towns became ghost towns overnight as civilians fled the violence. The Mexican government responded with more soldiers, more raids, more arrests. But the violence didn't stop. If anything, it got worse. The Sinaloa Cartel was fighting on multiple fronts, against the Zetas in the east, remnants of the Juarez Cartel in the north, and the Beltran Leyva organization in central Mexico. But somehow it held firm. One reason was El Chapo's uncanny ability to keep the structure running even during chaos. While the outside world focused on him, the real operations were being carried out by a decentralized web of lieutenants, traffickers, and assassins. Ismael El Mayo Zambada, Chapo's old ally, played a critical role in this era. He was older, quieter, and rarely seen in public, but his hand was everywhere. While Chapo soaked up the spotlight, Mayo kept the logistics clean, managing shipping routes, maintaining international contacts, and keeping the money flowing. Together, they made the perfect duo. One was the showman, the escape artist. The other was the brains. But every empire eventually faces the weight of its own legend. In February 2014, after more than a decade on the run, El Chapo was finally captured in Mazatlan, a resort city on the Pacific coast. He'd been hiding in a condo with a beauty queen and a modest security detail. The arrest wasn't flashy. There were no gunfights, no dramatic chase, just quiet efficiency, a tip, and a door kicked down in the early morning hours. Mexican Marines took him without firing a shot. It was a symbolic victory for the government and a massive headline for international media. The world had finally caught the man who had slipped through so many traps. But for Sinaloa, the story wasn't over. The cartel didn't fall apart. In fact, within months, it became clear that the organization was still fully operational. El Mayo stepped in to keep things stable, and Chapo's sons, known collectively as Los Chapitos, began asserting more control. The cartel's business didn't slow down. Drugs kept moving. Money kept flowing. If anything, the arrest boosted the group's legend even more. And then, just over a year later, Chapo did it again. In July 2015, he escaped from Altiplano prison, the most secure facility in Mexico. This time, the escape was straight out of a movie. Chapo had vanished through a hole in his cell shower, which led to a mile-long tunnel dug underneath the prison grounds. The tunnel had lights, ventilation, and a customized motorcycle rigged to tracks. It was precise, expensive, and pulled off right under the noses of the country's top security personnel. The escape embarrassed the Mexican government on a global scale and reignited the mythology around Chapo. People joked that he had better engineers than the government. Others simply shook their heads. Once again, the ghost was free. During his second run as a fugitive, Chapo moved more cautiously, but he still couldn't stay out of the spotlight. In a bizarre turn of events, he met with American actor Sean Penn and Mexican actress Kate Del Castillo. They interviewed him for a Rolling Stone piece that was ultimately more damaging than revealing. The meeting helped authorities track his movements, and in January 2016, just 6 months after his escape, he was caught again, this time after a shootout in the city of Los Mochis. He was captured alive, bloodied but alive, and paraded before cameras like a war trophy. The second arrest was different. This time, the Mexican government had learned its lesson. They didn't want a third escape. In 2017, Chapo was extradited to the United States to face trial. He was held in complete isolation at a high-security facility in Manhattan. Cameras watched him 24/7. His legal team was limited. Every move was documented. In 2019, he stood trial in New York City in what was dubbed the trial of the century. Witnesses included former cartel members, associates, and law enforcement agents. They described shipments of cocaine packed into jalapeno cans, bribes to top-level politicians, and even a murder carried out while Chapo watched via livestream. It was a circus, shocking, detailed, and impossible to look away from. The jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life plus 30 years and locked away at ADX Florence, the most secure prison in the United States. The legend of El Chapo had reached its final chapter, or so it seemed. But even as the man behind bars faded from the scene, the organization he built did not. In fact, the Sinaloa Cartel remained a major player in the global drug trade. Leadership passed into the hands of multiple factions. El Mayo continued to operate from the shadows. Los Chapitos, particularly Ovidio Guzmán, became more public. And while the Mexican government claimed victory with Chapo's imprisonment, violence across the country only increased. The drug war wasn't ending, it was evolving. What Chapo's final capture really did was force the Sinaloa Cartel into a new phase. The central figure was gone, but the machine kept running. There were now 3 generations of traffickers operating within the group. Old-school bosses, mid-level commanders, and tech-savvy young leaders using encrypted apps and crypto transactions to move product. The cartel had grown too large to die with one man. It had become a self-sustaining empire. Even in his absence, Chapo's influence lingered. His methods, his rules, his ruthlessness, they remained etched into the DNA of the organization. Every tunnel built, every bribe paid, every enemy gunned down in broad daylight still carried his shadow. His legend became a recruitment tool. His name became a brand. And the drugs kept moving north, untouched by the walls, laws, or headlines meant to stop them. After Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was locked away for good, many assumed the Sinaloa Cartel would collapse without its iconic leader. But that prediction couldn't have been more wrong. The reality was that Chapo had spent years preparing for succession, whether intentionally or by necessity. The cartel had never been a one-man operation. It was a sprawling enterprise, and his absence didn't slow it down. It simply reshaped the internal balance of power. Into the vacuum stepped the next generation, his sons, collectively known as Los Chapitos, and the ever-elusive Ismael El Mayo Zambada, who had quietly remained one of the most powerful figures in the organization all along. The post-Chapo years were marked by both expansion and fragmentation. The Sinaloa Cartel didn't shrink. It grew larger, more complex, and more violent. New markets opened up. Traditional cocaine and heroin routes were still active, but synthetic drugs were now taking center stage. Fentanyl, cheap to produce and exponentially more potent, became the new cash cow. Sinaloa labs began producing vast amounts of fentanyl precursors imported from China and India, turning them into pills and powder for distribution across the United States. The profits were enormous, but the risks were just as high. The drug's deadly strength led to skyrocketing overdoses in the US, drawing political fire and intensifying pressure from American agencies to crack down. But inside Mexico, things were even more complicated. Leadership inside the cartel began to fracture. El Mayo's faction, made up of older, more established figures, valued low-key operations and long-term strategy. Los Chapitos, particularly Ovidio Guzmán and his brothers, represented a younger, flashier, and more volatile wing. They were aggressive, unafraid of making headlines, and far more visible than their father had ever been. Tensions between the two factions simmered, sometimes erupting into deadly clashes. But for the most part, they maintained an uneasy alliance, tied together by mutual profit and shared enemies. That balance was tested in 2019 when Mexican security forces arrested Ovidio Guzmán in Culiacán. What followed was one of the most surreal and shocking displays of cartel power in modern history. Within hours of the arrest, hundreds of armed gunmen flooded the city. Roadblocks were set up, prison gates were smashed open, and the cartel began attacking military convoys and threatening civilians. Facing chaos and fearing mass bloodshed, the government made a controversial decision. They let Ovidio go. That moment was a public admission of how powerful the Sinaloa Cartel had become. It wasn't just a criminal organization, it was a parallel power capable of bringing a city to its knees. Since then, the cartel has only continued to grow its international reach. In Europe, they've established relationships with Italian, Albanian, and Russian syndicates. In Asia and Africa, they've found new routes for trafficking synthetic drugs. In South America, they still collaborate with Colombian and Peruvian producers to move cocaine northward. Even in Australia, law enforcement agencies have tracked seizures tied to Sinaloa shipments. What started in the hills of northwestern Mexico has become a global supply chain. Technology has changed the game, too. Younger traffickers use encrypted messaging apps, cryptocurrency, and dark web marketplaces to coordinate deals and move money. Old-school smuggling methods still exist: tunnels, hidden compartments, mules. But now they're supported by data analytics, drone surveillance, and sophisticated money laundering software. The new face of the cartel is younger, more educated, and more digital than ever before. Meanwhile, the fight with rivals hasn't let up. The Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG, has become Sinaloa's most dangerous competitor. Led by Nemesio Oseguera, known as El Mencho, CJNG is just as violent and even more aggressive in expanding its territory. The two cartels are locked in a brutal war across multiple states. Towns shift hands weekly. Entire regions have become battlegrounds where local police and even the military are caught in the crossfire. Civilians suffer the most. Mass graves, executions, and forced disappearances have become the price of war. Despite this, the Sinaloa Cartel remains at the top. Its decentralized model, deep political connections, and ability to adapt to changing markets have kept it one step ahead. While law enforcement agencies have taken down individual players and seized millions in cash and drugs, the core of the organization has proven nearly impossible to dismantle. It's not just the leadership or the firepower that keeps it alive. It's the culture, the loyalty, the corruption, and the desperation that have allowed it to root itself deep into every layer of society. The story of the Sinaloa Cartel didn't end with El Chapo's extradition. In many ways, it only entered a new chapter. The faces may have changed, but the empire remains, thriving in the shadows, controlling billions in narcotics trade and reshaping the criminal underworld across continents. And as long as the demand remains high and the system stays broken, it will be there, ruthless, invisible, and always one step ahead. The Sinaloa Cartel didn't disappear when El Chapo was captured. It evolved. Today, it's run by a new generation of ruthless leaders, expanding across continents and thriving in the shadows. The myth of El Chapo lives on, but the machine he built is very real and far from finished. As the war on drugs rages on, one thing remains clear. The Sinaloa Cartel isn't a story from the past. It's still being written. For more deep dives into real-world crime empires, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned.